Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Progressive Bitcoiner. I'm your host, Trey Walsh, and today we've got a great show for you. We've got Avik Roy from FREOPP, and FREOPP is the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, and they're a nonprofit think tank expanding economic opportunity to those who least have it. So Avik has been on the show before, and as I've mentioned at the beginning of the show that you'll hear, he had a conversation with former guest Mark Stefani a couple of years ago, back in February of 2022. And there's a lot that has changed, and yet a lot hasn't changed in terms of the conversation and the things to talk about. So Avik has such a wide background that I couldn't possibly illuminate enough in this introduction. He has a medical background, obviously his policy work, working on numerous Republican candidate campaigns, and FREOPP is completely nonpartisan in their approach. Really, they're pragmatic, trying to focus on solutions to problems, which we talk about a lot on the Progressive Bitcoiner, right? Not making things partisan, just looking at solutions and problem solving that us Bitcoiners really like to do. And yes, us progressive Bitcoiners as well. So this was a great conversation. We just did a pulse check on so many things on the policy front, in terms of a lot of legislation going on, political campaigns, the presidential election. We've talked about Bitcoin and the fact that Bitcoin is winning. What comes next for Bitcoin, regulatory concerns, policy work, how to talk to your local politicians and leaders about Bitcoin, and talking to progressives about Bitcoins, all the stuff that we usually like to talk about on this show. And Avik had such great wisdom to share with us. So I know you all are going to love this episode. And please check out FREOPP and check out Avik's work and the whole team over there. You'll see a lot of that in the show notes that we mentioned throughout the show. So check out FREOPP's website, subscribe to their newsletter and their mailings as well, to stay up to date with their great policy work. They do so many different things on talking about wealth inequality, nuclear and energy policy, a lot of these areas that we like to get into on this show as well. So I want to thank Avik for coming on the show and having such a great conversation. And for those listening, please be sure to share this with your progressive friends, share this far and wide, just in general, for someone who has deep knowledge of a lot of these issues and is able to talk about things in a really nuanced way, which we so appreciate. And be sure to like and subscribe wherever you're catching the show, whether it's YouTube, whether it's the pod channels as well. And if you have any questions at all, you can always hit me up at hello@progressivebitcoiner.com. And before we jump into the episode, I want to mention our awesome sponsors. You can check out Saz Mining to get $50 off completely renewable Bitcoin mining. You can get $50 off each miner in the show notes. And then Bitbox as well is the best way to custody your Bitcoin in cold storage. You're going to get 5% off with the promo code below, and that's at bitbox.swiss/TPB. And you're going to use promo code TPB to get 5% off. All right, I'll let you guys get to this episode, and we will see you again next week. Hey, Avik, and welcome back to the Progressive Bitcoiner. How are you?
Thanks, Trey. Great to be with you.
Yeah, happy to have you on. And obviously, right before we were recording, I was telling you that I had just listened back to the 2022 episode, February, like middle of February to be exact, you had done with Mark Stefani, the previous host of this podcast. Just listened back to that recently to refresh myself of what you all talked about. Mark's a dear friend. I think him and I share a lot of similar views and topics that I wanted to talk to you about as well in this episode. So I will say, folks, listen to this episode. It's going to be different, but go back and listen to that one as well. And Avik, you mentioned you might go back and listen to it yourself. I think that would be interesting for you as well. So definitely, folks, if you're hearing this, listen to this episode. No need to stop, or this isn't a part two, but go back and listen to that one. So anyway, before we get too much into this conversation, I'm sure that'll be robust. For those that don't know you, many of you will know you from your policy work, previous campaign work, through FREOPP, so many other things in your writings, Bitcoin Policy Institute, et cetera, et cetera. Do you want to give people a little bit of a TLDR on who you are and what you do?
Well, I've been around the block, but I'd say what's most relevant for this conversation is I run a think tank called the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity that is nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy research organization. We work on how to advance progressive social outcomes, increase social mobility, improve opportunities for people whose incomes or wealth are below the U.S. median, using the tools of free enterprise, individual liberty, technological innovation, and pluralism. So in a sense, we're trying to bring a broader political constituency to the table to care about and believe in and seek to achieve progressive social outcomes. So that's my main gig. I do a bunch of other things too. I'm the policy editor at Forbes. which is the main place where I write about public policy other than at freopp.org. It's FREOPP.org, one E rather than two. And I also, I'm involved in the Bitcoin world. I've owned Bitcoin for a long time, but I wasn't really public about it until relatively recently. I wrote a kind of, you could say, almost a coming out piece for a journal called National Affairs called Bitcoin and the U.S. Fiscal Reckoning, where it's a journal that's widely read in Washington, and I was basically trying to explain to the Washington crowd why Bitcoin is not merely a passing fad, why it's very relevant to the discussions people have in Washington about the federal debt in particular, and why actually people in the Bitcoin community should actually care a lot about what Washington thinks about Bitcoin as well. Because I think at that time, this was in 2021, there was this attitude of, hey, Bitcoin is this uncensorable network. We can do whatever we want. Governments can't touch us. And that while that's technically true, I think that the Bitcoin community at that time, and I don't know where it stands really today, I'd have to think about it. But at that time in particular, just didn't feel like Washington could do anything about Bitcoin. And I think in the last several years, it's become very clear to more people that in fact Washington can do a lot to make life hard for Bitcoin. If the goal is for everyone to use Bitcoin, for it to be easy for people to use Bitcoin, Washington and public policy and federal law can make it very hard for Bitcoin to be widely used. It can't stop the Bitcoin network from functioning, but if the goal is for everybody to have access to Bitcoin, particularly those on the bottom half of the ladder, there's plenty that Washington can do to stymie that. So that was really the goal of this article, and I won't say it went viral because it was a 60,000 word or 6,000 word article with not a lot of graphics, but it was widely read and caught the attention of a lot of Bitcoin OGs and commentators and things like that, and that started to put me on the map of the Bitcoin world, and so now I'm a lot more active in Bitcoin. At my think tank, we have an explicit vertical or practice group or whatever you want to call it in Bitcoin policy. I'm on the board of the Texas Bitcoin Foundation, and I'm the senior advisor to the Bitcoin Policy Institute, among other things. So I've gotten more involved in Bitcoin policy and just try to take advantage of this experience I've had, whether it's thinking about public policy, working on presidential campaigns, trying to be more helpful to be a translator between the Bitcoin world and the public policy.
Yeah, that's quite the resume. That's quite, you must, there's not enough hours in the day, it sounds like, for everything you want to work on and do. Yeah, I think, I'll jump right in here because the conversation you had with Mark is fresh on my mind. And one of the things that I was just mentioning is it was 2 years ago that you were having this conversation on Bitcoin. A lot of the conversation was about how do we engage with progressives with Bitcoin, with DC. Where does Bitcoin stand right now? Inflation was even higher at the time, but we're seeing that inflation is still sticking. There's ETFs now. I'm sure ETFs didn't even cross your mind, maybe super realistically at the time in 2022. And one of the points you made, I believe, was actually the title of the episode as well. Bitcoin is like the most progressive force ever, something like that. So we had one question. I think you had seen the tweet as well. I kind of put out from the Progressive Bitcoiner handle saying, "Hey, we'll be having a conversation. Does anyone have any questions?" That kind of thing. And we got one from Brian. He's been on the podcast as well. Longtime progressive Bitcoin OG proudly from Minnesota. And he said, okay, so you had mentioned that Bitcoin is like one of the most progressive tools or forces, possibly in the world a couple of years ago. Do you still feel that way about Bitcoin? And in general, what is your sentiment about Bitcoin now versus then?
Well, think about it this way: if anyone in that bottom half of the economic ladder had put a proportion of their savings in Bitcoin as opposed to the U.S. dollar, where would they be today? They'd be much better off, right? And that's maybe a relatively short term way of thinking about it. That's a 2-year time horizon, but I think that the events that have happened in the United States and around the world over the last couple of years have only reinforced the case for Bitcoin. And I would say, like, I think one thing I should point out or make clear is that what I think the case for Bitcoin is may not be what every Bitcoiner thinks the case is for Bitcoin, in the sense that there are plenty of people, for example, for whom Bitcoin as a mechanism of payment is really important. My friend Peter McCormack likes to talk a lot about, how he's traveled to Africa and how the use of Bitcoin for payment in Africa is really awesome. I'm less convinced that Bitcoin has a monumental advantage for payments outside of international payments. So, like, if you're trying to make payments across national borders, Bitcoin is really useful for that. But within an individual country, it's not necessarily the case. So, take India, for example. India has a really interesting tech stack that allows for digital payments using the Indian rupee or a digital version of it that are much cheaper than credit cards and much cheaper than Bitcoin, actually, in terms of transaction costs. So, from my standpoint, what really is the use case for Bitcoin above all else, what matters more than anything else, is its ability to be a store of value and to be censorship resistant. Those two things together. Um, the ability to be able to send value wherever you want around the world without anyone being able to stop you. That's really important for a lot of progressive causes. And but most important is that in a world in which elites, whether they're political elites or economic elites, want to rig the system in their favor and against ordinary people, to whatever degree they do that, successfully or not, Bitcoin is the solution that allows you to be able to protect your own assets from whether it's inflation, seizure, or manipulation by others. And, what have we experienced in the last 2 years? Inflation, right? Back then, and in 2022, we were starting to see it a little bit, which is why the Fed started raising interest rates in 2022. But now it's been enduring. Like, back then, there was a debate about whether it was transitory or not. Now it's not transitory. It's been several years. I mean, we still have not gotten conventional consumer price index inflation below 2%. And so, while you have a lot of people running around saying, "Oh yeah, inflation's down, everyone should be happy," like, if you actually ask an ordinary person, what's the cumulative effect of the last 3 years of inflation on my pocketbook, on my household budget? It's massive. And so, there can be no doubt that if you had parked your savings in Bitcoin with all the volatility of the last several years, despite all that, you still would have come out better today than you did a couple years ago. And again, a 2-year time frame is not really the right time frame to evaluate Bitcoin. You should evaluate Bitcoin over 4 to 6 years minimum, because actually what a lot of studies show is that basically, if you've owned Bitcoin for longer than 4 years, you have made money, period. No matter when you bought it and when you sold it, if your holding period was longer than 4 years, you've come out positively. Now, of course, that may not continue forever. There may be other things that happen, but over the long term, if you're the kind of person who works hard and plays by the rules and just wants to save and rise up and make life better for your family and your kids, Bitcoin is an amazing way to do that. It's an amazing way to reward people who try to save for a better future. I think that one thing that your podcast is about, and I bet your audience is about, is, there's to some degree, there ought to be a bigger debate within the progressive movement as to how to achieve progressive goals. I feel like what I see is that to be a progressive, one has to subscribe to a certain set of policies as opposed to the solutions, right? So, for example, if you want affordable housing or affordable healthcare, there are lots of ways to achieve affordable housing and affordable healthcare. But to be a capital P progressive, you're supposed to only subscribe to like 2 or 3 of those options on the menu, as opposed to some of the others. And Bitcoin is kind of like that. If you are a progressive in the sense of, you write for the nation and you work for Elizabeth Warren, you're supposed to have a certain set of views about Bitcoin that may be very different from what actually achieves progress, what actually increases social mobility, what actually protects the interests of people on the bottom half of the ladder. And that's what guys like you are trying to fix.
Yeah, you said a lot there. And gosh, do I wish I feel like every time I have a little question or thought on how do we approach this, I want to be like, what would Ovik think? It's so interesting that you say all of that. And again, like I mentioned, your previous conversation with Mark is fresh in my mind. My good friend Logan as well, who's very active in the Bitcoin community. He's a lawyer, also was a former like Bernie progressive like myself. And there's a lot of Bernie Bros, I call them, now in Bitcoin, who are progressives, and I think there's a reason for that. Sure, policy wise, you could have some different arguments there, but what I try to tell a lot of Bitcoiners, because this show does two things I've realized. One, it's slowly starting to appeal out to more people, just in terms of the progressive Bitcoin. That's an interesting combo. Okay, let me listen here and there. Maybe I can check out Bitcoin. It also teaches Bitcoiners and libertarian US based libertarians that not all quote unquote progressives are Elizabeth Warren or are centralized totalitarians. Most of the progressives that I talk to, myself, my friends, we've been pretty pissed off with the government for quite some time. Going back to Patriot Act in my childhood and all of these things, 9/11, we're not necessarily looking for those answers. We have a value set. So that's what we talk about a lot on the show is a value set. And I am much more in the pragmatic camp. There are other progressives that might not be. Where I am less at this point concerned about is it the right method to get there? I'm more so wondering how we've been doing things from any political framing has not gotten us there. And I know that's what you focus on a lot at FREOPP. But my friend Logan and I talked a lot about capital P versus lowercase p progressivism. And we did a whole episode on this a few months ago, and we said it so much that people were probably so tired of it. And it's a little niche the way we classified it. I wish there was an easier way to do it, but that really is the name of the game. Is if you're a lowercase p progressive, this is my opinion. I think you are ripe for having these conversations, being open to what we're talking about, open to Bitcoin. If you are a capital P progressive, for me, it's harder to reach that audience right now. There's a lot of resistance still with environmental factors, Elizabeth Warren camp.
Well, the art of persuasion is being somebody. You can only. It's very hard to persuade somebody of something if they don't feel you share their values. I think the what your audience and your community can do is help make those inroads by saying, first of all, hey, we have the same values. Have an open mind about some of the things we're talking about. I was in Washington this week. I flew back last night to Austin, where I live now, and that's what's behind me in this video is downtown Austin. Um, and I watched this new documentary, Finding the Money, which is basically a documentary by and about Stephanie Kelton, who has become the leading exponent of modern monetary theory, which I'm sure a lot of people, if not everyone in your audience, knows a lot about. And it was very interesting to watch this documentary because it's very much of this vein. It's like, hey, we are the progressives. Stephanie Kelton, I don't know if she still is, but was the chief economist for the Senate Budget Committee, where Bernie Sanders is the chair, and has applied a lot of her ideas in using that platform. Among other things, she's a professor at the State University of New York at Stony Brook. And one of the things that she argues, actually, really their core argument, the MMTers, is that, well, we can print all this money and it's okay because, unless there's inflation, which is kind of funny because it's all we've experienced ever since the MMTers had their heyday. But their argument is that the value of MMT, meaning the value of spending all the money in a deficit increasing way, is that money ends up in the pockets of ordinary people. Hey, if we spend all this extra money, we can solve inequality. We can solve the problems of unaffordable housing and unaffordable healthcare and all the other things that progressives want to achieve. What's remarkable about that assertion is that the evidence is exactly in the opposite direction. And what I mean by that is that in the 53 years since 1971, where we detached the U.S. dollar from the value of gold, and therefore enabling this massive deficit spending, where you just print the dollars to make up the difference, what has happened? We've had the biggest increase in wealth inequality in the United States probably ever. I mean, I hate to use the word ever because maybe there's some period in the 1800s where it was worse, but the wealth inequality has massively increased, and the reason why wealth inequality has increased is because when you print the money, it doesn't go to poor people; it goes to the banks. When the Federal Reserve prints money, it literally is handed over to financial institutions. And last time I checked, progressives are supposed to be against making the banks richer. And yet, when you print the money the way Stephanie Kelton and Elizabeth Warren want to do, because Warren is a big believer in this approach to monetary policy as well, what you're doing is you're massively increasing the wealth of the financial sector and making it that much harder for ordinary people to buy a home or to afford the things they need for their daily lives. And I find this just complete ignorance of the actual consequences of their policy to be astounding. Rich people are wealthier than they've ever been thanks to all the extra money that flooded into elite economic institutions during the pandemic. And yet Stephanie Kelton feels like this is the time to publish a documentary about how great she is and how smart she is. I just find it incredible.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think it's really hard because one of the things that I try to do a lot, really, and I talk to other Bitcoiners about, but for me, I'm like, I remember when I didn't know about money. I didn't know about how the economy, how these things actually work, right? I had a understanding of sociology and economics in undergrad, but to this extent, right? Energy markets, all of these different things you kind of learn about through this process. So I try to go into it with that, saying, okay, a lot of times these folks, maybe not folks in leadership positions, but let's say average people that might go along with these theories, good intentions, really good intentions. But I like having this conversation with you. Your whole work and practice is based on what is the data telling us? What is this actually telling us? And it's telling us that's not actually the case. And I want to bring up one funny point too, because I haven't seen the film yet. I do need to go out and watch it. Familiar with her work and a lot of writings that she's done. There was a popular video that was passed around that I'm sure you saw as well. Maybe at the time of this recording, maybe 2 weeks ago, a month ago, where it was an advisor to Biden for the economic advisor. You probably know this person maybe personally, or you know of them. And they were speaking to her, and they didn't really know. They were coming off as if they didn't know how debt monetization actually worked and how we actually created money, spent money, used debt, all of these things, right? And for her perspective, it was to point out, okay, the government doesn't really know what they're doing. MMTers can help with this, right? For Bitcoiners, they saw that rallying cry and they're like, see, the government doesn't know what they're doing. But it was kind of funny because I'm like, do Bitcoiners realize this is the MMT film that this is actually from? So it was kind of a funny, I feel like a lot of Bitcoiners put that film on their radar and MMT back on the radar because of that clip. So I thought that was kind of funny from the film.
Yeah, so Jared Bernstein, I do know him personally, and he is the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors in the White House under Biden, which is there's several different economic policy organizations within the White House. The two most important are the Council of Economic Advisors, which are kind of like the more academic forecaster types who try to project how economic growth is going to go, GDP, things like that. Do much more of the kind of research-based work. And then there's the National Economic Council, which is more of the policy-oriented part of the economic policy team, where they really try to say, okay, based on our view of the economy, what do we think we should do on X or Y or Z? But yeah, he runs the Council of Economic Advisors, and yeah, it was a train wreck of an interview. I watched the whole thing, and he clearly I always try to watch these things with a charitable lens to see if something's being taken out of context or not. But he clearly does not understand how the federal debt works. And frankly, that's a problem for a lot of people. There are plenty of conservative economists who don't understand how the federal debt works. And one thing I will give the MMTers credit for is they are right that we have the ability just in the United States, not everywhere. That's another thing that this movie doesn't really talk about. The United States has what the French call the exorbitant privilege of being able to borrow in its own currency and print more dollars than it really ought to by rights be able to do, and not suffer the consequences as severely, because we are the number one world's greatest superpower and because so much of the world revolves around the US dollar, and the dollar is the world's reserve currency. But like all exorbitant privileges, if you abuse the privilege, eventually it collapses. And so it's like saying, like, let's say you're the kind of person who, we all know somebody who can just eat whatever he or she wants and still stay thin. They have some like great metabolism, right? It's not because they work out more than us. They just have genetically a great metabolism, right? And so you're like, I wish I could have that great metabolism, just eat donuts and still be able to be, not fat. But eventually that person will still get heart attacks and high cholesterol and all the other things. So, the idea that you can just keep doing these things forever and there will be no consequences, it's just not true. And a lot of my policy writing, like that article, Bitcoin and the US Fiscal Reckoning, I have another one on a related vein coming out later this year in 2024, is on this topic of, okay, like what happens when, people get tired of all the borrowing and the debt becomes too big. And the MMTers hint at this when they say, yes, the real limitation to our ability to print money is inflation. But what they don't seem to understand is when that will happen. They swore up and down in 2021 and 2022 when Biden came in that we could spend trillions upon trillions of dollars and it would be no big deal because inflation wouldn't occur. And then inflation happened. And in the documentary, they actually acknowledge this to some degree, but then they said, well, the inflation wasn't our fault. It was because of COVID. It was because of the lockdowns. Well, who were the champions of the lockdowns? The progressive movement were the champions of the lockdown. So, I don't think Stephanie Kelton, I don't remember her when the lockdowns were happening saying lockdowns are really bad and we should not lock down the economy because it'll cause inflation. I don't remember her ever saying that. But in fact, inflation has continued even after the lockdowns were lifted. So that's not really what happened. Inflation is a result of too much money in the economy because, like, the way to think about it is imagine there's a pie and you divide the pie into 4 pieces, and let's call each of those 4 pieces of the pie $1. Okay, so if you all of a sudden say we're going to have $8 rather than $4, all you've done is divided that same pie into 8 pieces instead of 4. So yes, there are 8 pieces of the pie, but each piece is half of what it used to be, and that's inflation. Your purchasing power has been cut in half, all else being equal. And so this is the challenge that every other country faces. If you're Argentina and you try to run a huge debt and not be able to pay it back, you get screwed right away because you're borrowing in US dollars. You're not borrowing in Argentine pesos, and so you can't devalue your own currency because if you do that, the size of your debt actually goes up because it's in dollars, not in pesos. So that's the big advantage that the US has had for a long time. But that advantage is coming to a close. Right now, we have a $34 trillion debt. We're going to be at 50 trillion in a few years. If all goes well, we'll be at 50 trillion in a few years. If things go badly, who knows? But once the debt starts to get to 100 trillion, 150 trillion, which, if you're a listener to this podcast, if you're 20 years old, like when you're 40, the federal debt's going to at least be $100 trillion, probably $150 trillion. And there's only about $400 trillion in the world. Like the entire wealth of the world is about $400 trillion. So you literally run out of other people's money. There's just not enough money that's lying around in the rest of the world to lend to the United States. And so what happens? As people stop lending money to the United States, as that lending dries up, interest rates go up, all else being equal. Because if you are trying to borrow money, if you're the US, you're doing that by issuing treasury securities, treasury bonds and bills and notes. And if the market doesn't want to buy those bills and notes because they think America's broke or they just don't have anything left over to lend to the United States, you have to offer a higher interest rate on those bonds in order to attract buyers. That's how interest rates go up. And the Federal Reserve, of course, doesn't want interest rates to go up because they know if interest rates go up, then markets will crash. The economy will struggle because it makes all of your car payments go up and your home mortgages go up, and businesses that want to borrow money to expand, they can't do it because it's more expensive. Having interest rates being higher will slow down the economy. So the Federal Reserve, what do? They say, okay, we will buy those excess treasury bonds that no one else wants to buy by printing more dollars out of thin air. So they keep interest rates down by doing that, but then they printed more money and that pie has gone from, the 4 pieces to the 8 pieces, and everyone's purchasing power has declined. That's what creates the inflation. And so the MMTers try to gaslight a little bit by saying, well, we're not really as crazy as everybody thinks, because we do think there comes a point where you can't, just run up deficits forever because there's going to be inflation, and that's when you need to stop. But they have no systematic thought as to what causes inflation and why. We've been having massive inflation over the last 50 years. Uh, and that's why so many things are hard to afford today that weren't as hard to afford 50 years ago. And it's been caused by the very things that the MMTers support.
Yeah, and that's the hard truth that a lot of progressives. I almost there's a couple of different camps. I think let's take the MMTers or Elizabeth Warren or folks in positions of power. And I say power, whether it's private power or political power, which is different from the people, which a lot of Bitcoin and why I'm here doing this is because we think it enables a lot of great things for the people. So the power structures, I almost view it in three camps. There's the either they're completely ignorant on this, they are aware of this, but very entrenched and want to keep it going, or they're aware of it, but they think we still need to do this because we know what's best for lending to the rest of the world, right? For what you mentioned with that privilege, right? And I would argue, in my opinion, I'm curious how you view this, because Brad Sherman, as you were talking recently, Brad Sherman was speaking about the Fit 21 bill, and in crypto and Bitcoin in general. I I think I posted something saying he actually gets it. Something with Bitcoin, not to get into the whole doomsdayer of, okay, when the US dollar crashes and the economy crashes, Bitcoin will be here. We can live underground with Bitcoin, all of this stuff, right? I'm not advocating for that. A lot of people will get hurt in that process, and I hope that doesn't happen. But he said, with something like Bitcoin competing against the US dollar, we have the privilege to do what we will as the reserve currency, as the lender, as all of these things. So Brad Sherman just saying the quiet part out loud, that isn't that quiet anymore. Alex Gladstein has been talking about this quite a bit through HRF. Progressives should be up in arms in a lot of ways about this, right? The type of toll that system takes on the globe, on the global financial system. And Brad Sherman literally coming out and saying, Bitcoin is a threat to that because we want to be in control. Full stop. And seeing nothing wrong with that. That is deeply concerning to me for all of the reasons that you mentioned. And I don't think that what you said should be a politically conservative take, right? It might be a political party take at some points, but I think the nuance can be in some of the policies and way to do things. But what you described, in my opinion, and I'm curious how many listeners you can ping me if, what you think. This is devastating. It's not a great system for anyone to operate under, regardless of your political stripes.
Well, again, we can look to Argentina, where capital P progressives have, generally speaking, run the country for the last 100 plus years. And or I should say, like, with this particular philosophy of, deficits are fine, they don't matter, and they do matter. And again, the U.S. is a special case because under in the current world where the U.S. is the top of the heap, we have more ability to borrow money than others, than Argentina or many other countries. But I would say, I think the most important thing for progressives to understand is, why is there wealth inequality? What the standard take you'll hear from a capital P progressive politician is, well, the reason we have wealth inequality is because the rich don't pay their fair share in taxes, and the economic system is excessively controlled by rich people, the rich and corporation, let's say, in the second bucket, right? So let's start with the second one first. The second one is in a sense the more straightforward, in the sense that the U.S. is not any more like that than any other country. If you go to France, if you go to Germany, you don't think the wealthy and the corporations have influence in German politics or French politics or Italian politics? They absolutely do. And arguably more so in many cases, because, like, to take France as an example, the French have this philosophy of national champions, where they actually go out of their way to say, we're going to create one petroleum company that's going to be the French petroleum company that we're going to we're not only going to, like, root for, but we're actually going to go out of our way to protect and subsidize so they can dominate European markets. That'll be good for France. And that's Total Elf. Then in pharmaceuticals, it's Sanofi. Sanofi is the big French pharmaceutical company that the French go out of their way to support, so that that they are the champions of Europe, but it happens to be a French company. The French do this, and most European countries do this, where the big businesses that have a lot of international success, they go out of their way to protect and serve the interests of those companies because they believe that that's the way to advance their national interest. And so, if you actually compare the U.S. to other countries in terms of the influence that corporations and the wealthy have, well, we're not that different. We're not better. We're not worse. It's about the same. Now, let's go to the tax side. So, if you say, okay, the reason why there's more wealth inequality in the U.S. is because rich people don't have to pay taxes. The opposite is actually true. The U.S. has the most progressive tax code in the developed world. Among advanced wealthy countries, the wealthy pay a much greater share of the tax revenue the government collects than in any other advanced wealthy country in the world, and whichever one you want to pick. Canada, the UK, Western Europe, Scandinavia, whichever one you pick. In those countries, much more of the revenue that goes to the government is actually funded by the middle class, because every single one of those countries has this national sales tax called a value added tax, or VAT. And the core driver of tax revenue in those countries is the VAT. Typical country, it's about 20%. So for everything you buy, everything that a business buys, you pay this 20% or 21% VAT. And so all those, entitlement programs, the welfare programs, the healthcare, all those things that the progressives want the U.S. to have, and they look to Europe with envy of, those things are funded by middle class taxes, not by taxes on the wealthy. We already massively over-index for taxing the wealthy relative to those other countries, and a big part of why is because in those other countries you can just move. Like, France knows that if they raise taxes too much on the wealthy, they'll just move to Belgium or Switzerland or somewhere else, and they'll get taxed under those markets. Just like if somebody who gets overtaxed in New York or California can move to Texas. And so there's limitations, in fact, on how much those European countries or even Canada can tax wealthy people. So we are much more aggressive on that than those other countries. So if you believe that the reason we are not more progressive as a country is because we don't tax the wealthy enough, the facts are actually in the other direction.
Hi, everyone. Hope you're enjoying the episode. Today's episode is brought to you by Bitbox. Now, Bitbox is a hardware wallet that's open source, incredibly secure and easy to use, and it's what I'm using to safely secure my Bitcoin in cold storage. Now, I know self-custodying Bitcoin can really be intimidating, but Bitbox is designed for ease of use without compromising on security. It's USB-C compatible and allows you to easily back up and restore your private keys with a micro SD card, which is really cool. Now, you can purchase the Bitbox using the promo code TPB at the link found in the show notes for 5% off your purchase. And I really want to thank Bitbox for their support of the podcast. All right, I'll let you get back to the episode now. Yeah, I think our country has there's so many different conflicting things that aren't based in facts, just someone taking the time. There might be people listening that haven't taken the time to sit and think about what you just said before, right? And that's an informative first step. And I think there's so many different things that we can still disagree on with nuance, but some of these structural things that you're mentioning are not working. I think there are so many things, the way I feel as a progressive still, I think there are so many systems and codes that really work against poor and working people in the US, including tax structure, including some income tax structure. And that's a whole separate conversation, but really punishes the poor and working class, that progressives are really obsessed with state and federal income tax. And that really affects the poor and working class. Inflation really affects the poor and working class. So many of these decisions pump asset prices that usually benefit the wealthy, unless you're, what's that film that came out? You're on Robinhood and day trading, and you got lucky with GameStop or something like that, right? Which young people decided to do because they were crushed with student debt in college, and they're like, we have to figure out something else. So there's all of these conflicting things with progressive leaders. They're going down this path that is really, in my opinion, hurting working class people. And there's data that you're suggesting that would support that as well.
There's an article on our homepage. So if your viewers or listeners go to the FREOPP.org homepage, again, it's FREOPP.org, and you scroll down, there's an article on the homepage called 7 Problems with the Way We Think About Income Inequality. And some of the data that I was just describing is in that article.
Great. Yeah, we'll be sure to include that. Well, the first article that you wrote a few years back, we'll put that in the show notes as well. But yeah, there's a lot of great data and articles from a wide ranging team you all have as well, writing a bunch of things. I think there's a little bit of something for everyone, even if it just gets you thinking about these things, right? We don't have guests on to say, all right, Ovik is 100% right on his opinion on XYZ, right? It's to have these conversations, to get to thinking again. We are, yeah, the name might seem a bit partisan, the progressive Bitcoiner, but there's so many reasons we have that as the name, just in general, to let progressives know they can look into Bitcoin, but also to reimagine and reopen what progressive can be and was and is, and the hope for the future with Bitcoin. So yeah, definitely, folks, check that out as well. Yeah, I mean, there's so many things just in this conversation, and thinking through. I think one of the things that I wanted to ask you about kind of pointedly is from the progressive camp, from the leaders. And I am very critical, folks, of the right of conservatives. But, with progressives and Democrats, sometimes it feels like you've got to criticize the family a little bit. You've got to say, what are we doing here? Because I've seen a lot of people affected. I've seen a lot of politicians over the years saying many, many things that have not come true for making life easier for younger people and poor people in this country. It's very frustrating. In terms of Bitcoin, in terms of thinking outside of the box about building wealth for people in this country, why do you feel that Democrats and those that have been resistant to something like Bitcoin, or resistant to thinking it's not just about Bitcoin, resistant to thinking outside of the box on this isn't working, since 2008 with low interest rates, with these crashes, with COVID, all of these different things, fiscal spending, these things are not working for lower class. We can move numbers around here and there, and make it seem okay, the economy is doing great, but affordability is not, right? So why do you think there's so much resistance, right? Some people might say it's just as simple as politicians wanting to hold on to power, or career politicians. We need to change up that structure, because I am conflicted on how much Bitcoin does change in that regard. So for you, just thinking through, a lot of our listeners have been Democratic voters, are trying to talk to their reps. Actually, a lot of our voters are very active in their local, or a lot of our listeners are very active in their communities, or emailing and calling their reps when they see Bitcoin on the ballot and things like this. They're very active with their politicians. Why do you think they're just not as open as in some regards, I would have expected them to be by this point?
Well, I understand it. I mean, I think in politics, this is true on the right and the left. There's a certain tribal thing where you want to be part of the team, and if you look around and you see the majority of the team believes X, whether or not and you don't have a strong opinion yourself about it, and you haven't done the work yourself to have your independent opinion, you're going to trust that, hey, all the people who share my values have this position, at least most of them do, so I'm going to go along with that. And so there's very much in politics a kind of team or tribal feeling that people have, and that leads people to default to what they think the majority is saying. If you're a politician, there's even that even gets amplified, because your biggest threat to reelection is being primaried, and so you want to make sure that you're on the right side of what you think the base of your party believes. And so if the base of the party believes one thing, it doesn't matter if there's an intellectual case in the other direction, unless you really become so you know worked up about it that you're willing to take that political risk. It's just easier to go along to get along. So that's what you see. The one counter to that is that you were talking about some of the bills earlier that are coming through Congress, and there has been Democratic support for some of those bills. Notably Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, went against Biden, said, "Hey, I'm going to support this bill." And I think it's not so much that Chuck Schumer and Richie Torres and Cory Booker have all ideologically or philosophically converted over to the progressive Bitcoiner point of view. Maybe in Richie's case, he's been pro Bitcoin, pro crypto for a long time. What you're seeing is that the New York City area members of Congress that are Democrats are hearing from the financial industry, and they're saying, "Hey, you guys are shutting us out of this incredibly important line of business that would be valuable for us, and help us out here." And the New York area members of Congress understand that these are, I'm sure they give to their campaigns, but even more so, like these are economic engines for their districts and for their states. And so they're responding to that, which is important. It's obviously, if you're like me or you, then you want to reason with people and come to say, hey, this is intellectually the best solution, and this is the thing that's going to do the most for the people that we want to help, and all that's great. But when it comes to politics, practical politics, sometimes those arguments don't work. And what works is, hey, pure self-interest. I live in the New York City area, and New York City area is really driven. The financial industry is the driver of our economy, and if the financial industry is saying this is important to us, then we got to go along with that. And that's okay in the sense that part of how I think people like us are going to change minds in the progressive movement, not with everybody, but with enough people, is to make that argument. Say, hey, like, look, there are jobs at stake here. There's an economy at stake here, and these are this industry that's grown up around Bitcoin is valuable for the people you want to help in that way. And so, that's a factor. And I think one of the things that motivated me to write that article in 2021, Bitcoin and the U.S. Fiscal Reckoning, was that if we can just prevent the Elizabeth Warren types from like banning crypto, quote unquote, for enough time, maybe it takes 5 years or 6 years or 7 years, that the industry becomes large enough that it can start to advocate for itself and influence Congress, then we'll win. And that's where the approval of the Bitcoin ETF in January was such a huge moment, because that was something that people have been trying to do that since 2013. Gemini, the Winklevi, proposed the first ETF in 2013, and the SEC has been sitting on it ever since. And it finally got through because of a lot of back and forth with the courts. But that was huge, because once you have a Bitcoin ETF, it's a lot harder to prevent people from using Bitcoin, because that then will affect the ETF, which a broader range of institutions and individuals will hold. So that's good, right? The more people that own Bitcoin, even in ETF form, means that the constituency that supports Bitcoin will grow. And I think something that progressives have long understood is that the more people that are connected to something, the more votes you have to support that thing, and that's good for progressive Bitcoiners in this context.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think, of our audience of Bitcoiners in general, there's a lot of mixed feelings, I think, about a lot of this. Some of what you said as well, just the ETFs in general, about industry, some of the Bitcoin OGs that you've referenced that you've been in contact with, right? It not because they always wanted this. Obviously, Bitcoin growing and achieving all of these things, some people and Bitcoin OGs would have thought Bitcoin will consume the world in a lot of ways, these industries. But it must feel kind of weird as well, this pet project, this cypherpunk movement into now BlackRock, and for progressives, right? BlackRock talking about Bitcoin very openly, right? I'm like, well, that doesn't necessarily help the progressive cause, or those progressives that already view BlackRock in one regard. So, from your end, kind of thinking about all of this, thinking about Bitcoin in general from a 30,000-foot view, how do you view the industry now here? You referenced some politicians, which I don't know if we'll get into a little bit more, but you kind of referenced it, a bit more bipartisan support, some politicians getting on board for the reasons you mentioned. In terms of Bitcoin's success and what you think and what you articulated earlier, part of its purposes as a tool, or what it's most effective at, do you view it as this Trojan horse that's really doing what some people thought in terms of the game theory? And do you have reservations about some of the things we've been seeing with, industry and politicians, things like that?
Look, industry is always going to look out for itself. That's the nature of industry, and in a true competitive market system, that should work okay. It's when people try to rig the rules in favor of themselves and in ways that block competitors that creates problems. And I think that the Bitcoin community has been pretty good about that, I think, in general. What I see more of is it's some of the people, say, in the Ripple crowd, that are saying, hey, we have to ban Bitcoin because it consumes too much energy, and so let's use Ripple instead. And that's clearly a transparent effort to advantage Ripple, which is primarily owned by a small group of elites that pre-mined it relative to Bitcoin, which has its share of distributional challenge, but is much more accessible to a broader range of people. But that brings me to that point, which is I have this forthcoming article that I mentioned as part of a group of articles called the Satoshi Papers that the Texas Bitcoin Foundation is putting out. And one of the things I write about in that paper is that if Bitcoin succeeds, is basically the point of the paper is, what if Bitcoin does the thing that we all think it will do, which is eventually replace the US dollar as the premier store of value? How will the US government fight Bitcoin then? And what will be the social consequences and the social disruption that could occur? Because the fact is, even today, it's a very small fraction of the overall population that owns Bitcoin. And of the fraction that owns Bitcoin, the distribution of Bitcoin is very unequal, right? There's the OGs, as you said, own much more than people who are just learning about Bitcoin today. That doesn't mean Bitcoin can't help people who start today. It absolutely can. But if we move into a world in which Bitcoin is the currency that everybody thinks around and is the unit of account, the medium of exchange, and all the other stuff, then there is going to be this aristocracy of people who were in early. And are we okay with that? And maybe we are, maybe we aren't. But I think that a lot of the people who don't have Bitcoin today are going to feel very left behind, and they're not going to be happy if Bitcoin is unequally distributed. And so part of the solution there is obviously for people like yourself. You're doing your part to sort of spread the word about Bitcoin, get more people into it. I think that's incredibly important. One of the most important things that any Bitcoiner can do is, even though it can be tiring at times, to try to do your part to convince other people to at least put part of their savings into Bitcoin, get used to it. The more adoption we can engender, the better. And the policy piece is important there too, because to the degree that Elizabeth Warren and others are trying to prevent more people from using Bitcoin and trying to convince people that Bitcoin is this terrible thing that they should stay away from, countering that is really important as well, creating more opportunities for adoption. So to take the case of the ETFs, I know there's some Bitcoin purists out there who say, oh, the ETFs are terrible and it's not like really owning Bitcoin and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, look, I get all that, but you know what? There are advantages to the ETFs too. Yes, it's not as censorship resistant as owning Bitcoin directly, not your keys, not your coins, and all that stuff. But you know what? There are huge advantages of an ETF too. You can't lose your private keys to an ETF. If you get hit by a bus tomorrow, the ETF automatically goes to your heirs. There are a lot of things about an ETF that are, because it's it's plugged into a very well-established financial system, is actually very good for ordinary people who are scared of those things about Bitcoin. One of the things I hear the most when people say, I'm really interested in investing in Bitcoin, but I'm just so terrified about losing my password or losing my private keys. That is the number one thing that I hear from people who are actually very open to owning Bitcoin. They buy everything else about the fact that the government is driving inflation and spending our money and all that kind of stuff. So the ETFs are a real service in that regard. And I look at it as a gateway drug. You buy the ETF, and then after you get used to the ETF and you say, hey, I really like this Bitcoin thing, it's working for me, then they graduate to converting their ETF holdings into owning Bitcoin directly.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think that argument personally is overblown, because I remember I first bought Bitcoin. I first got into Bitcoin early 2021, so not that long ago. And I think I bought on Coinbase. I didn't leave that Bitcoin on Coinbase. I became a bit obsessive about, how do I protect this? How do I make sure it doesn't go under? Because I don't necessarily trust Coinbase or trust these. As a progressive, I didn't trust these private corporations to do the right thing, to not over leverage and be irresponsible. So I've heard that a little less and less now, which is good. But I will say, for people that invest, even if they do the ETF, whatever, a lot of times you got to trust people that they'll want to learn more. They'll want to do some self-custody stuff. And there's great new self-custody tools coming out every month, it seems, and better multi-sig solutions that are pretty easy. And, even Casa with their inheritance plans now and all of this stuff. is really great. Some people will just do the ETF, they still benefit. Others will continue to go down the rabbit hole, just like any other technology, hobby, passion. And people rarely just stop right at the beginning of something that's working if we believe that Bitcoin is working. And if it's not, then they won't.
The same is true, by the way, with ETFs in the conventional stock market. So it used to be, before ETFs became mainstream, that if you wanted to invest in the stock market, you had to pick the individual stocks. You had to say, okay, do I want to own Microsoft or AT&T or General Electric or whatever it is? And that's a lot of work for people who don't otherwise have an opinion about which company they should invest in. And it became clear that, or you could put your money in a fund manager who would charge massive fees to manage your money for you. And so ETFs became a truly progressive innovation, in that more and more people were able to participate in the stock market, meaning they could capture those economic gains instead of relying on the interest rate in their checking account. And that democratized investing in the stock market. So that was a massive win for ordinary people who just didn't have the ability to say, okay, I have an opinion that this stock is going to outperform that stock. And so the Bitcoin ETF is similar in that it gives people that accessibility. And I think we're already seeing that the adoption and the ownership of Bitcoin based assets are much greater because of the ETFs. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't risks. I think it is theoretically possible that a future, let's say Elizabeth Warren is president and she really hates Bitcoin, and she says, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to ban the ETF. I'm going to ban ownership of Bitcoin outside of the ETF. So that way, all the Bitcoin you own has to be owned through the ETF, not through personal holdings, as a way of making sure I can tax it and control it and make sure you can't flee the country with your Bitcoin or something like that. That's theoretically possible. Again, I think the financial institutions that own Bitcoin would aggressively oppose that, because that would tank Bitcoin's value, or at least there would be a risk of that. It might actually have the opposite effect. It may actually drive Bitcoin's value up as more people try to buy the thing that Elizabeth Warren is trying to ban. But so there are definitely things to watch out for. But overall, more adoption is good. More businesses and more industries having a stake in Bitcoin's success is good.
Yeah, and I'll people can explore that on there. And I do think and hope there would be some sort of court, or I don't want to say constitutional crisis, but perhaps with with that sort of move, there'd definitely be some courts with which I think wouldn't end as terribly as people might assume in that regard. But I hear you on that, on the theoretics, and also people will say it's kind of like trying to ban the internet at this point. Cat's out of the bag, in my opinion. A couple of things I want to make sure to discuss with you before we uh, get off this conversation is about the election year and about what we've already been seeing that you've alluded to with some bipartisan support for Congress. But the first thing, focusing on Elizabeth Warren, which again, we focus a lot on Elizabeth Warren, talk a lot. It's really easy, but Elizabeth Warren is one of many of these types of figures that have an idea about something. It's Bitcoin today, it's something else tomorrow, right? It's different flavors of the day. So I don't want to put too much time and attention into that, but it has caused quite a lot of havoc, I would say, in my opinion. Do you think that Elizabeth Warren, Gary Gensler, again, two completely different people and positions and authorities, do you think in terms of their influence over, and their influence is questionable at best, right? Elizabeth Warren, it seems to be, really no offense intended, a lot of hot air, right? There hasn't been a lot of actual things that have come out that are detrimental quite yet from her, in terms of, there's some legislation that's been pending, things like that. But in terms of, a lot of it's just been rhetoric, very loud rhetoric at that. Do you think their time and influence over Bitcoin is coming to an end? As some people say, Bitcoin is winning, they're done. Gary Gensler's going to resign, all of these things, right? Do you think that their power and influence in conversation with this is coming to an end? Or do you think there's more left that they're going to try out in the next few months, next few years?
Well, first, I would say that I think Elizabeth Warren has enormous influence. She's not merely someone who's a noisy critic of Bitcoin, but she is very strategic and very persistent and very motivated. A lot of senators will say that, like, she has these kind of anti-crypto or financial surveillance bills that they don't want to sign, that they don't want to vote for, but she collars them in the hallways of the Senate and says, "You need to vote for my bill." And she really kind of almost harasses her Democratic colleagues to support stuff that they don't have as much of a dog in the fight on. And so, and not only that, not only is she personally out there really pressuring her colleagues and peers to support her initiatives, but a lot of the people who staff these agencies, like the SEC, like the Federal Trade Commission, like the Treasury Department, these are people who have either worked for Elizabeth Warren or are part of her informal network of people who share her worldview. So Elizabeth Warren is actually a massive force of nature who is incredibly influential behind the scenes on a lot of this stuff. And there is nobody, whether within the Democratic Party or outside of it, who is as skilled at implementing their differing agenda on these issues. So she's been incredibly influential, I'd say, number one. Number two, I think one thing that's interesting from a standpoint of the 2024 election is that Trump has become more pro-crypto. He, in his previous term as president, was much more skeptical about Bitcoin and crypto. And for the reason that he's like, well, look, I am a nationalist. I believe in America. I believe in the US dollar. I believe in King Dollar. I don't like this idea of Bitcoin being out there competing with the dollar. I think the dollar is a thing we should support. And his staff or his senior, like his cabinet officials, like Stephen Mnuchin over at the Treasury Department, they were also Bitcoin and crypto skeptics. They were just kind of classic TradFi types who aren't so into Bitcoin. And so his administration was kind of just like the Democrats. There was kind of a split between what you might call the nationalist right, which felt like the dollar is more important, and the more libertarian right, which was more pro Bitcoin. Fast forward to today, to 2024, and we're seeing something a little different, which is that Trump seems to have intuited that there is this constituency up for grabs called the Bitcoin crypto community, because he spends a lot of time in New York and obviously knows a lot of people in the New York financial world. And so he's come out and started to say a lot more pro crypto things. And there are a number of Democratic voters, he senses, who will flip to Trump over Biden because they're single issue voters if they're Democrats who are otherwise progressive on capital P progressive on the issues, but feel like the Democratic Party is being hostile to Bitcoin and crypto. So that's a very interesting development, because Bitcoin had not been as partisan 3 or 4 years ago as it had become a few months ago. And I think that's also clearly influencing what Chuck Schumer and some of the others like Cory Booker are seeing. Is like, hey, we can't let Republicans own the issue of Bitcoin and crypto. We've got to show that we have our take on it as well, a positive take on it as well. But going into this 2024 election, Biden versus Trump, I think it's pretty clear that Trump has staked out the more explicitly pro-crypto position, whereas Biden has been more on the skeptical side, maybe not less so in his words, but in the actions of his administration. And so if Trump manages to win, I think it's going to be interesting to see whether he follows up on that rhetoric. I think there's a decent chance that he will, based on what I'm seeing. And if that's true, if like Hester Peirce is the chair of the SEC under a second Trump administration, that could be a pretty significant development, right? Because that wasn't the case. The old SEC under Trump, Clayton was not very pro-Bitcoin. He was quite a skeptic, actually. He's kind of flipped now that he's out of office. But he was not a pro-crypto guy, pro-Bitcoin guy. So whereas Hester Peirce is she gets it. She gets the ecosystem very well, is very thoughtful about it. And that could be what everyone thinks of Trump. That's one area where he appears to be more favorably positioned from a crypto standpoint. So I think that's going to be interesting to watch. And we'll have to see how much that influences the election.
Yeah, I mean, there's a non-zero chance some of the things you're talking about, right? Like, why risk it? I mean, I had a conversation with Kyle Schneps on our pod a couple of months ago, and I think the title was "Bitcoin is on the ballot," and he is firmly of the opinion that it can only be positive to come out in support or at least neutral on Bitcoin, on crypto. We focus specifically on Bitcoin, but most people at this point will know that a lot of lawmakers, and there's some distinctions they're trying to make between commodities and securities and things like that. But a lot of policymakers are just looking at digital assets in general. And in my opinion, we need to get a little comfortable with that, right? We need to educate people on the differences, but don't lose fights over you said crypto, I'm going to leave the room, right? That's just the nature of the beast in DC. But Kyle was of the opinion, and I kind of share that it's not negative. There's only a very small amount of left liberal voters on the internet, like fringe Greenpeace folks, I'm not sure, that will be like, I'm not voting for you anymore if you come out in support of Bitcoin, because they're going to throw all the other values and issues away and vote for Trump. That's not going to happen, right? So I'm of the opinion it can only bode well for the party. So
I totally agree with that. I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
I think that it's crazy for Democrats to throw away the Bitcoin crypto vote because, as you say, it's only a positive. Like there's nobody who's going to vote Republican because they're mad that Democrats are pro Bitcoin. On the flip side, there are plenty of people who will vote Republican if they're mad that Democrats are anti-Bitcoin. That seems pretty clear. And I'm guessing and sensing that there are Democrats who realize this, but again, because Warren in particular is so ideologically committed in the other direction, she has a lot of pull.
Yeah, and listen, I stand corrected with what you said. I think that's very, very real. I think my point earlier was your point was better in the sense of there is a lot of power influence. As of yet, that hasn't come to fruition, but clearly she's talked with a lot of folks. She has the ear of many folks. She has the ear of Biden and a lot of regards in terms of economic policy. That part is real and known. So one of my thoughts here, because a lot of our listeners or progressives are not interested in voting for Donald Trump, regardless of his stance on Bitcoin and crypto. And I myself, I've said it on this show before, the progressive Bitcoiner is not in the business of we're not going to endorse a candidate. We're here to talk about progressive values in Bitcoin and let folks decide for themselves. With some people don't vote, some people are very engaged, whatever. I personally have said it before, I'm a registered independent for the past several years. There's a lot of progressives in that camp that are independents that are just like, everything is a mess. But there are many people that are like, I will absolutely not vote for Donald Trump. Yeah, I feel he's an authoritarian. I don't like his stance on what he's allowed in terms of the courts with issues like abortions and state rights and all of these things, right? So in that regard, if you were to talk to Democratic leaders or the Biden administration, right? Because we've seen some representatives come out in full support of Bitcoin and crypto, but at least in a more neutral and open stance. We've seen other Democratic lawmakers not speaking about it, I think mostly out of fear of Elizabeth Warren and others that you've mentioned, but kind of keeping a neutral stance, which is fine. What would you say to some of these folks that are looking at polling indications, looking at, well, to be fair, we've kind of been pissing off young liberal voters over the Gaza situation, over inflation in the economy. We're trying here, but we're really not sure, right? So in terms of Bitcoin and crypto, what are some things you would talk to them about, like ways to change course? And do you think that the Biden admin would change course? Because you're right, maybe there's not a lot of rhetoric, but there's been a lot of policy or actions, like even the tax on miners, right? What, up to 30% electrical tax, which basically pushes miners out of the United States, which could then benefit Russia and other places that they really don't want to. So that's a whole confusing thing. So,
well,
what can Democrats do?
Look,
here,
I think the good news is that Bitcoin has not sorted yet in a partisan way, the way, say, abortion or climate or some of these other really kind of touchstone issues have. I think you can be, and there are plenty of Democrats who've shown that they are pro Bitcoin and still very. Ron Wyden is a great example. He's not just a random senator. He's the chair of the Senate Finance Committee. He's very much a guy who believes in financial privacy and the utility of technology in that regard. He doesn't like tax evaders, but he is very, he's pro financial privacy and pro technology's utility in that. So I think there's, other than the sort of New York area congressmen who are really focused on their local industry, I think there still is plenty of room for, members of Congress who share our views to just say, hey, look, I'm pro Bitcoin because I believe that it helps us achieve progressive goals. And here at ABC is why. I think if you make that case to a progressive audience, you know, you may get some disagreement. You might get some, from the Elizabeth Warren types, but I think you're not going to get kicked out of the room for saying that. I just don't see that right now. Yes, there's a lot of eye rolling in progressive circles about, maybe the more toxic maximalist types who have a libertarian bent. But I think people are open to these arguments. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but that's what I see. I feel like you can make those arguments, and what's important is I will say this: like, it's a big country, and it's easy to think you can't make a difference, but you absolutely can. I mean, look at me. I'm really, I had no connections in the public policy world. I was just a guy with a keyboard and an opinion, and here I am doing all this stuff. Um, the fact is, if you get involved, and particularly where you live, with your local members of Congress and your local senators, they will listen to you because you're a constituent. And if you really make a point of banging down their door and calling in and saying, I want to meet with you to talk about why I think Bitcoin is progressive, make the arguments. And maybe they disagree with you, maybe they don't. Maybe they give you a fair hearing. But the only way they're going to change their mind is if they know there are people who they are obligated to be responsive to who feel differently. That's what makes them take your arguments seriously. If you live in California, you're trying to convince a congressman from New Jersey, you're not going to have a lot of luck unless you're very skilled, very persuasive, or run a big national organization. But your local congressman absolutely will care what you think.
Yeah, I am hopeful and think that, because for a little bit there were a lot of Bitcoiners that were like, you know what, the politicians are never going to get it. We don't need them. Bitcoin doesn't need them. My opinion has always been like, well, if you're a citizen of that country, you might want to care a little bit. Bitcoin doesn't care, but you might, as a person, as an individual. I think with some of the heat coming up with regulatory concerns or with samurai, with other things of privacy, and we've been having chats around that on other episodes of our show as well. Some folks are starting to see the benefit of, I don't say it doesn't even have to be official lobbying groups, but Bitcoin Policy Institute, Satoshi Action Fund, others, Texas Bitcoin, like so many other groups that are really important and also doing their part. So I would echo that to our listeners: is you can always do your part. You can always send an email. You can always do a phone call. You can always go to their office hours, and my congressman does kind of local events and things like that as well. And you're not going to stand up in a room and yell Bitcoin, but you'll be able to have a conversation and say what's important to you. I think that's really important for people to remember going into this year. And Ovig, one closing thought from you as well, because I want you to talk a little bit about your work at FREOPP. I encourage people just to dig through those resources, keep up with you, obviously, in the great work and your forthcoming article that you mentioned. But looking into this year, a lot of the things we end up talking about the show can be a little overwhelming at times, can be kind of like, especially with politics, especially with rhetoric, can feel overwhelming about what change is coming, right? And a lot of us are into Bitcoin because we want the world to be a better place. We want people to flourish. We want humans to flourish and be able to save and combat inflation and all of these things. What are you most hopeful about right now, thinking about this policy front, thinking about people's lives in the US specifically, this year and going into the next year? It can be related to Bitcoin, but it can be in general as well.
The number
most
one
hopeful
thing
about?
I'm most hopeful about is Bitcoin itself. The fact that we have Bitcoin, the fact that, kind of going a little bit against what I said before, the fact that even if the politicians screw it up, we can still own it. The resilience that Bitcoin network has to government interference, and the confidence that we can therefore have that it's going to be there for us when we need it, is incredible. It's incredible that we have an institution or an ecosystem like Bitcoin that the politicians can't take away from us. That's an incredible victory that we should feel very, very lucky about, because prior to Bitcoin's existence, that didn't exist. And that's an amazing thing. And I'm thankful every day about the fact that Bitcoin has given us the opportunity to have that protection from authoritarian governments, whether it's our own or anyone else's. And that's the core of progress. What is the great liberal achievement? What was the great liberal achievement of the United States? It was the idea that the government couldn't intervene or interfere with your rights as an individual, as a human being. And Bitcoin is a thing that allows us to take that into the 21st century. So I think we should all feel very lucky to live in the time we do, where even if you don't believe you can convince the politicians to change their minds, you don't have to. You can build a community outside of political system. I'll never forget the first time I went to the Bitcoin conference. I hadn't gone for many years because, as I mentioned, I was trying to stay private with my involvement in Bitcoin. But then I went. It was one of the COVID years. I can't remember if it was 2020 or 2021 in Miami. And you're in this, convention center, and it is packed to the gills with, more than 10,000 people. And I remember thinking coming out of that meeting, like Bitcoin is not. It's a social movement. It's not merely a piece of software. It's not merely a group of people transacting with each other financially. It is a social movement. And why is that important? It's important because every social movement, what being part of a social movement engenders is far and beyond purely the economic incentives. There's so many examples in the Bitcoin community of people who do things, not because they're going to make money doing that thing, but because they want Bitcoin to succeed. The way people say, here, I'll send you $10 worth of Bitcoin so you can see how easy it is to use. Or the fact that you take your time to do this podcast, knowing that, the reason you're doing it is not because you're going to rake in huge advertising bucks. So I know but not that you don't raise any, but you do it because you're trying to spread the word, right? And that's such a big part of the spirit of the Bitcoin community is how much people look out for each other, how much people are willing to help each other, how much people do things for the broader social value and success of Bitcoin rather than for their own self-interest. I find that remarkable. And you compare that to Silicon Valley, say, where, if you spend time in Silicon Valley, there's much more a culture of what's in it for me when I talk to you, when I deal with you, when I work with you. And in Bitcoin, it's just not like that. It's a very selfless community. I find that really, really impressive and gratifying. And the reason why Bitcoin will ultimately succeed, because we are more committed to our success than those who oppose us are committed to our failure.
That's a great note to end on for this episode. I mean, we could chat for so much longer. Thank you for your time. I think people will get a lot out of this conversation. Just a pulse check on, hey, Bitcoin is winning. We still have more to go. Everyone can do their part. And hopefully if people hadn't looked into FREOPP before and your articles and things like that, they will now. So please do that. Anything that you want to mention specifically from FREOPP that you all are looking into currently or want to point people to specifically?
Well, I encourage people to check our entire website. I think there's a lot of stuff in there that progressives will find interesting. One thing I might mention, we just did a big paper on the closure of the Indian Point nuclear reactor in upstate New York and how that's affected carbon emissions and electricity costs in New York. And I bring that up just because so much of the Bitcoin debate is, at least the anti-Bitcoin debate, is about energy consumption. And the fact is, there's absolutely no reason for us to be complaining about Bitcoin's energy consumption because we could generate an infinite amount of energy with no carbon emissions if we just built more nuclear plants. So this whole idea that somehow we have to care about how much energy Bitcoin consumes is a canard because we have the technology today to generate an enormous amount of carbon-free energy. We just choose not to use it. And this article, though it doesn't explicitly talk about Bitcoin, is very relevant to that piece of the conversation. I mentioned the piece before about 7 problems with the way we think about income inequality. That's another one that people will find interesting. You can follow our work either at the Twitter account FREOPP, FREOPP, and you can follow me on Twitter at AVIK. Those are the two. Twitter is definitely a good place to keep an eye on what we're doing. We also have a Substack, freopp.substack.org. I believe that's right, or the other way around. Maybe it's substack.freopp.org, where you can subscribe to our newsletter and hear more about what we're doing.
That's great. Avik, thank you so much. You've given me a lot to think about, even though I feel like I think about this stuff nonstop. There's always more to think about. So I appreciate you taking the time today and having this chat. And we'll definitely have to do a part 2, part 3. We'll keep up and keep tabs as the election gets closer as well.
Thanks, Trey. Thanks for all you do.